Welcome to Able or Unable to Work, Life Trajectory After Severe Occupational Injury. We're glad you're here. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You'll be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. As I mentioned, my name is Yusra and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenter today is Dr. Jarna Pasanen. Dr. Jarna Pasanen is a university teacher at the Faculty of Management, University of Tampere in Finland. Her responsibilities include teaching various courses in the degree program of Insurance and Risk Management and conducting research within this field. Her scientific interests include social risks, such as disability, and the different ways to manage them in a changing world. Pasanen's latest publications deal with the rehabilitation process and return to work after an occupational accident or illness. In her dissertation, she studies the management of disability risks from the perspective of social insurance systems. And now I'll hand it over to you, Jarna.
Okay, thank you so much, Yusra. Hopefully you can all hear me. And good morning, everyone. Or actually, it's already evening here in Finland. But as Yusra told you already, my name is Jarna Pasanen, and I'm working as a university teacher of risk management and insurance in Tampere University, Finland. And my discipline, Insurance and Risk Management, is part of the Faculty of Management and Business, and I'm actually a Master of Economics at the moment, and I'm doing my PhD. However, even though being a Master of Economics, my research interests include social risk management and social insurance, as mentioned before, and these interests are actually the way how I ended up doing research related to work wellness and disability in the first place. My doctoral dissertation is indeed about the role of insurance systems in disability risk management. And here in the first slide of my presentation, you can see my contact details, and do not hesitate to contact me if there are any questions, cooperation proposals, or something else related to the themes that I'm researching. I'm more than happy to answer you even after this webinar. And today, I am going to talk about my latest scientific article published in Disability and Rehabilitation Journal last year. As some of you may notice, here you can see the name of the article. My last name has actually changed since. So my maiden name was Kulmala, and I am the first author of this article. And my co-writers were Professor of Statistics Arto Luoma and Professor of Insurance Science Lasse Koskinen. So let's start, shall we? So today's headline is Able or Unable to Work, Life Trajectory After Severe Occupational Injury. So we are going to find out what happens to the people who have suffered a severe occupational injury. Will they return to work, try rehabilitation, or stay partly or fully disabled for a longer period of time? In addition to this, we will also find out how the life situations evolve during time, and also what are the determinants of the different life situations. I will start with a brief introduction to the topic. Then I will introduce you the objectives of our study, tell you something about data and variables that we used, and then show you, of course, the results. And at the end, we are going to talk a little bit about discussion. So what are the strengths and limitations of this study? What is the contribution of this study to this field of research? So, introduction. In 2017, there were 127,991 occupational injuries in Finland. Well, this number alone tells you not much, but in further details, so that you know what we are talking about, there are around 5.5 million inhabitants in Finland at the moment. And this amount has been pretty much the same since about 10 years. The amount of employed people was about 2.5 million last year. So if you compare these numbers, 127,000 to 2.5 million, you can already make some sort of understanding about this phenomenon. But even better way of illustrating the occupational safety in Finland is the frequency of accidents rate, which is calculated by dividing the number of workplace accidents with the number of hours worked during the same time period. So in 2017, for example, the frequency of accidents across all sectors was 29 workplace accidents per 1 million hours worked. So 29 accidents per 1 million hours. In addition, we can see from the statistics that 7% of all occupational injuries in Finland were severe. What do we mean with severe? Well, generally in Europe and in particularly in Finland, an occupational injury is defined as severe if it causes over 30 days of work. Okay, these were the first statistics. I also think that it's important for me to tell you very briefly something about the Finnish workers' compensation system so that you will understand our choices that we made doing this study and also analysis better. So in Finland too, we have a workers' compensation insurance. Specifically, all wage earners in Finland are insured according to the Occupational Accidents, Injuries and Diseases Act. And this act defines the content of the statutory insurance cover. As you may well know, the basic idea of this insurance is to compensate for the loss of income resulting from injury. Firstly, I mean, this is the Finnish system that I am trying to introduce you at the moment. So firstly, in Finland, the injured worker is entitled to a daily allowance for 360 days from the day following the injury. And if the disability continues after this, the injured worker is entitled to an injury pension. So you can see here the daily allowance, if it's over 360 days, so 1 year, then injury pension is the next one. And the injury pension is paid as long as the injured is disabled due to the occupational injury. Of course, this means that the compensation can be lifelong. The disability can also be partial, which is not shown here in the slide, but in this case, the daily allowance or the pension reflects the diminished ability to work. In order to get the partial compensation, your ability to work must be reduced a minimum of 10%. And if it is reduced 10%, you will be receiving 10% of the full amount of the allowance or pension. Well, in addition to these, the workers' compensation insurance includes also a rehabilitation allowance. And this rehabilitation allowance is paid during occupational rehabilitation. The occupational rehabilitation includes, for example, guidance and counseling, work trials in the previous or in some sort of new job, or you can supplement your occupational skills and get some training, which eventually hopefully leads to an occupation. It can also be education for a degree. So many choices, but always occupational, no medical. During the medical rehabilitation, the person is receiving daily allowance or injury pension. The amount of this rehabilitation allowance is equivalent to the disability allowance and disability pension. So there are no differences. And this is the pure basics of the Finnish workers' compensation system. Well, in Finland as well, I guess in everywhere around the world, the major objective, or one of the major objectives of the workers' compensation system is to restore the worker's ability to return to work after the injury. According to previous research, return to work is extremely important not only to the injured workers, but also it is important to their employers and in a broad sense to the whole society. So it is no wonder that this objective is usually emphasized and reflected also in several academic studies about RTW, so return to work. There are a few basic questions that researchers have been trying to find an answer for. And the first one is about return to work rate. So how likely is it to return to work after an injury or illness? The second question is about determinants of return to work. So what are the factors that explain whether one will return to work or not? A bit more introduction for you guys still. So, as already mentioned, there has been various studies about return to work during the last decades, but majority of these studies have focused on illness or sickness absence. In addition, many of these studies do not distinguish injuries from illnesses. However, I believe that it is important to acknowledge some crucial differences between those two. So we have illnesses and we have injuries. But if we consider, for example, the recovery process and improvement in the ability to function, they are very different, depending on whether it's injury or illness. One example of this, if we think about chronic illnesses, they tend to be very slowly emerging, which means that there is a gradual decline of functional ability. And this progressive nature of most illnesses cause slow diminishing of the essential resource factors such as self-esteem, well-being, economic situation. All these things, they slowly deteriorate and at the end result in a poor ability to function in the future. But in contrast, if we are talking about injuries, for example, work-related injury, usually these before mentioned resource factors are not weakened before the injury, but injury will result in a sudden decline in the ability to function. And then after this sudden decline, there is natural healing, medical treatment, and rehabilitation. And because of them, the ability to function will only improve over time. So the logic is very different from the illnesses. And this is why it is important to investigate the return to work patterns and determinants also that are related purely to injuries. Well, wasn't it all. Now I've explained to you why it's different, why it's important to acknowledge the differences between injuries and illnesses. But in addition, you also have to acknowledge some differences between work-related and non-work-related injuries. You can see the differences between these two types most clearly when it comes to the return to work process and outcomes. For example, in Finland, there are relevant differences concerning the benefit system and stakeholders involved when we are comparing work-related and non-work-related injuries. Workers' compensation insurance, which we are talking mostly here, it is only responsible for work-related injuries, but it does not compensate any other injuries. So a major difference is there too. Okay, now I think that I have somehow tried to explain to you why is it important to focus to injuries as well as illnesses, but also injuries, and why is it important to focus on work-related injuries. Well, I'm not the first one, unfortunately, or gladly, who has thought about this matter, and there have been many studies that concentrate on occupational injuries and are made before ours. The interest of these studies has been firstly on return to work rate that I already mentioned before. And as you can see from here, the results suggest that a vast majority of people return to work after the injury. However, according to these studies, disability recurrences are common. So injured workers do return to work, but at a later stage, their health gets weaker again, and they have to take sick leave. And then maybe they will again come to work, but there are these recurrences that are very usual, according to the studies made before ours. Depending on the study, 85 to 94% of injured workers have had at least one return to work. So this is quite promising, but the rate of success significantly declines over a longer time span. So this is the first question. It's about return to work rate. And the other interest is in determinants. There are also studies that reveal some results on this matter. So, the previous studies have identified many factors that are related to return to work outcomes. And these factors include socio-demographic, clinical, economic, psychological factors, as you can see from there. And these studies indicate that younger age, higher education, higher pre-injury income, good health status, higher job satisfaction, solid social and economic support, and minor injury severity all promote return to work. So this is what we knew beforehand. And the next question was, what's missing from these previous studies? We know a lot, but there was still some points that we wanted to find out. Okay, so a few things. One of them that was missing was sufficient information about probabilities and permanence of other life situations, such as full disability and rehabilitation. So we did know what was the return to work rate approximately, but we had no idea how many people were ending up to be fully disabled for the rest of their lives. How many went to rehabilitation and what were the results of that? So we started talking about life trajectory instead of only the pure return to work. So earlier researchers seem to be highly interested about only the return to work rate, but there were no information about other possible life situations. There were only no information about any changes in these life situations in a longer time period. And this is what we originally wanted to find out. Why? Well, this one explains some of the problematics behind calculating or researching things like return to work rate. So how do you determine who are working? Most of these previous studies determined an injured person as working if he or she didn't receive any insurance benefits anymore. So when the workers' compensation benefits stops, they automatically assume that these people are working. Of course, we know that it might not be true. They might be still sick, they might be unemployed, they might be in rehabilitation, perhaps something like that. And we wanted to know what are the percentages and what are the life situations of these people who had suffered from work-related injury. In addition, what's missing? The other one that's missing, well, longer follow-up periods. Most studies that were made before had fairly short follow-up periods from 6 to 24 months. And thus, they leave open questions about the longer-term post-injury life course. And we thought it would be very useful to investigate the matter for a longer time period so that we would know what happens to these people after they have been working for a while. Do they stick with it or maybe something else? And that's why we need longer follow-up periods. More what's missing. Well, the earlier research had not been focused on severe occupational injuries before. I already told you that there had been many studies made about occupational injuries, but the severity is something new. And as I already told you before, the severe occupational injury was the one that caused over 30 days of work. It was actually kind of weird that we were the first ones concentrating on these injuries since these cases are the most important if we think about secondary prevention. Because the vast majority of all work injuries cause only 1 to 3 days of work, and thus they require no specific efforts on or intervention strategies. And that's why the research attention should rather be targeted on severe injuries, where these efforts are mostly needed. So, what were our objectives? I have a few of them here. First one, to examine the probabilities of return to work, full disability and rehabilitation after a severe occupational injury. The second one, to investigate the permanence of these life situations and transitions between them. And the third one, to study the connection between these life situations and working at a later stage in life. So now you know what we were about. Then I will tell you shortly something about the data and variables that we used in our study. Firstly, there are two major register keepers related to pension, disability and work-related injuries in Finland. The first one is the Workers' Compensation Center, so WCC, and then the second one is the Center of Pensions, FCP. And we were able to gain several registers from these authorities. Firstly, we collected all cases of severe occupational injury that happened in 2008. So these we got from WCC, and then we combined all other register-based data with them. We classified an occupational injury as severe if it had caused over 30 consecutive days of work by the end of 2009. And this data includes both workplace and commuting injuries. At the end, we were left with 11,585 injured. And the registered data sets were, of course, anonymized, I guess so, yeah. So it was not possible to trace individuals from them. As said already, the main data included all occupational injuries that happened in 2008, and we wanted to have a 5-year observation period. And in the end, we used the life situation in 5 anniversaries following the injury, and that was our base for the analysis. The primary data is this WCC data, and it included information about all the severe injuries, and it was classified according to the European statistics on accidents at work. So the data had information about the age, gender, occupation of the injured, the time and place of the injury, the type of the injury, and part of body injured. Then also we got another data set from WCC, and there we had all information about insurance compensations for medical care, loss of earnings, functional limitations, rehabilitation, death, and other costs for the years 2008 to 2013. So with this data, we were able to see whether the injured was receiving workers' compensation benefits. Then we also had few data sets from FCP. The first one is about social benefits and pensions. And again, years 2008 to 2013. So we were able to see from this data whether the injured was receiving some other social benefits, such as old age pension, unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, or parental benefits, or so on. In addition, FCP also handed us the data set that included all employed periods and yearly incomes of the respondents. So basically, this register includes all employment contracts in Finland. And with all this data, we were able to classify the life situation of the injured pretty precisely. We combined all these data sets so that it was possible to determine the life situation of every injured person in 5 anniversaries following the occupational injury. And we actually used this last register to determine whether the person was working or not. So we knew that the person had employment contract and was gaining some income. And that's when we determined that, okay, this one is working actually. So here are some characteristics of injured. As you can see, most were male, 64%, aged over 50, 41% here, and well, only 24 in the youngest age group. Most of them were working in manufacturing, 30%, then mining, construction, and so on. Also one student there. Location of the injury, well, 76% were injured in their workplace and rest were commuting accidents. And here you can see that upper and lower extremities were the most common body part that was injured, and the type of the injury was typically bone fractures, dislocations, sprains, and strains. Then the actual first result table. So this table shows the life situations of individuals following a severe occupational injury. So here you can see the 5 anniversaries following the injury. And here you can also see life situations. There are actually pretty many of them. As you can see, the vast majority of injured were working during all the anniversaries. However, you can also see that there is a clear decline in the number of workers as time goes by. In the first anniversary, 71% of the injured are working, whereas the percentage of workers is only 59 in the 5th anniversary. This decline is partly explained by the growing numbers of old age pensioners. So if you check out the old age pension, you can see that amount or the percentage of old age pensioners is growing year by year. But this is not the only transition, but we will observe the other ones later on because this table does not show them to us. Well, the amount of fully unable to work, the second row, it is quite small to begin with, only 6%, and it still declines year by year, as you can see, being 3 and 2% in later years. So sounds pretty good that only 6% and then 3 and then 2% are actually fully unable to work. Okay, well, on the contrary, the number of those who were partly unable to work, the number slightly increases with time, but the amount of partly unable to work, the amount of them is at a very low level of 23 to 52 individuals throughout the observation period. Also, the number of rehabilitees on the next row is very low. It varies between 38 and 109 individuals, basically only under 1% of the injured. Other quite interesting finding from this table is the amount of unemployed that is under the rehabilitation row. The number of unemployed stays around 10% throughout the observation time. And if we compare it to the unemployment rate of Finland, it has been between 6.5 to 8.5 during the observation time. And when we compare these figures or these numbers, we can clearly see that unemployment was a bit higher among the injured. However, the characteristics of injured in our study, it really differs from the averages among the whole Finnish population. So this matter would insist more precise research, and we cannot make any reliable conclusions based on this table only. However, it is interesting and it might be a good idea to research it more thoroughly. And lastly, about this table, the last row is, well, maybe almost the last row, other situation here. It includes, for example, the students, the ones in sick leave due to other reasons than occupational injury, those that are on parental leave, and the ones living without social benefits or work income. I think that was the most important stuff from this table. Let's move on to the statistical analysis. There were the few tables that I showed you guys were the basic information about the injured. However, that was just a beginning for our research. So besides the actual life situations, we also wanted to know the probabilities of different life situations and the transitions between them, if we take into account the preceding life situation. So we used a method called a simple Markov chain analysis to examine these probabilities. What is this Markov chain analysis? Well, Markov chains describe transitions between different states by assuming that the probabilities of different states only depend on the previous state, so no other factors there. Very simplified analysis, but it enables us to research what are the probabilities of different life situations and the transitions. So in this study, we examined 5 life situations that are the states in this simple Markov chain analysis. And these 5 situations were working, fully unable to work, partly unable to work, rehabilitation, and other situation, as you can see from there. So even though the previous table, we also included there some other life situations, but they are not the focus of this research. So the next analysis tables do not have, for example, the unemployed with them. But all unemployed students and stuff like that, they are all in other situation category. In addition, we also wanted to know what are the determinants of return to work based on our research. Specifically, we were interested in the effect of a previous life situation. So we wanted to know how much does the previous life situation affect the later working. And that's when we used logistic regression analysis. And here is the table 3, one of our result tables. And this table shows you the transition possibilities between 2 consecutive anniversaries from one life situation to another. So this table, as you can see, it consists of 4 components, and they all provide the transition probabilities between the life situations on 2 anniversaries. I've already tried to highlight some interesting or most important numbers here. So the first component, if you look, it shows the transition probabilities between the first anniversary and the second anniversary. And we can see from the first table up there that those who were working on first anniversary, so the first row, 84.1% of those people were working also on the second anniversary. So if we look at the first row that says working, then you can see that 84.1% of those who were working on the first anniversary are working on the second anniversary. The next number, 1.1%, describes that 1.1% of those who were working on first anniversary are fully unable to work on the second anniversary. And so on, same logic. Okay, let's go to the most interesting findings that this table reveals. So first of all, the percentages of workers throughout the observation period. It's quite interesting because if you check out all the components and the working, the percentages are over 84%. So this tells you that if you have worked on one anniversary after the injury, it is very likely that you will be working also on the next. Moreover, most transitions from the state working happen to state another life situation. So you can see the percentages that they are very low to fully unable to work, partly unable to work, or rehabilitation. But if you were working last anniversary, you are most likely to work also the second, and if you're not working, then you are in another life situation. And in most cases, this indicates retirement, unemployment, or disability to other reasons that are not related to the occupational injury. There are only a very small fraction of the injured that transferred from state working to state fully unable to work. And that's, of course, a good thing. And it tells us that the recurrences don't seem to be so usual among these people. Other interesting finding is related to this group called fully unable to work. So the second group. As we can see, fully unable to work is not as permanent life situation as the working. So a considerable amount of injured will return to work even though they would have been fully unable to work in the first anniversary. Actually, the rate is 28.8%. So almost 1/3 of those who were fully unable to work on the first anniversary were working on the next. Of course, we can also see that this return to work from fully unable to work, it decreases over time. And if we check out the last table from 4th to 5th anniversary, there is only 10.1% who are returning to work after they were fully unable to work on the last anniversary. A fairly similar development of transition probabilities could be detected also among those who were partly unable to work. The transition probability from partial disability to working was 43.5% between the first and second anniversary, if you are looking at the first table. But then it significantly decreases after this. And the last interesting finding from this table is related to rehabilitation, so the third row. It seems to be surprisingly permanent life situation as well. Actually, the majority from 59 to 71% of the rehabilitees on any anniversary were also in rehabilitation after 1 year. So very permanent. Why? Well, this might be explained by the nature of occupational rehabilitation. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, the occupational rehabilitation may contain education leading to a degree, and of course this takes time. And all in all, even with a time period of 5 years, we are not able to tell the full effect of occupational rehabilitation. But still, the percentages of return to work after rehabilitation seem to be very low and are thus pretty worrisome. That was perhaps the most important ones from that table. And then we have the last, but maybe not the least, result table here. And this result table shows the results of logistic regression. And we did this because we also wanted to find out what are the determinants of return to work. And we also wanted to include the factor of previous life situation, which no one had done before, at least, so that we would have known about it. So in this table, first of all, you can see the number of injured and the percentages in the first column. Then the next column is odds ratio, and this odds ratio represents the odds that an outcome will occur. For example, you can see when you are looking at the gross annual income group, and there you can check out the 10,000 to 20,000 euros, and you will see that the odds ratio for that is 1.18. This 1.18 means that in this income group, the return to work is 18% more likely than in the first group. So as you can see, we have usually selected the most unlikely return to work groups to be the comparison group. So they have the value 1.00. And then we compare the rest of the groups to that one. And that tells us, oh, okay, well, odds ratio was that one, and then there is still the 95% confidence intervals for odds ratio. But as you can see from this table, younger age and higher gross annual income are associated with increased working. You can also see these 3 stars, and they mean that the result is statistically significant. So younger age, more income. In addition, working was more probable among non-manual employees than among manual workers, because as you can see, the mining, construction work, manufacturing, they are the ones where return to work is least likely. So they are the manual work. And the table continues. Here you can see that those whose injuries were in the upper and lower extremities, they had the highest probabilities of working, and those with injuries in the neck or the head had the lowest probabilities. And then there is a type of injury. You can see that the differences between the injury types are quite small, but still bone fractures, wounds, and superficial injuries are associated with higher probabilities of working, whereas concussions and internal injuries are associated with lower probabilities. And the last factor is the previous situation in life. So here we use the fully unable to work group as comparison because it illustrates best the differences between all life situations. And you can see from this table pretty much the same results as in Markov chain analysis before. So the life situation on one anniversary is a strong predictor of working in the future. And from this table, you can see also that the odds of working on a specific anniversary were 15.15 times greater for an individual who had worked on the previous anniversary than for an individual who had been fully unable to work. So a strong predictor if you are working in the previous anniversary. So we still have, I guess, a few minutes time. I'll be brief with the discussion. So the results. Overall, 85% of the injured were working during the 5 anniversaries of the injury. And this is in line with the previous results. But it's still relatively high if we consider that our study was about severe occupational injury. So quite good result, I guess. The second thing, our study showed that the permanence of working was high, and actually over 84% of those working on one anniversary were doing so also on the next. And in our study, only 1.7% experienced a recurrence of disability, and this is very low compared to the previous other studies. Few more important points. The amount of those who were fully unable to work declined over the years from 6 to 2. And these numbers are fairly low if we compare them to the previous results, where about 10% of the cases the injured became fully unable to work for long periods of time or permanently. Also, the results show that the longer the disability period, the less likely the injured worker will ever return to work. This is actually the result that is accordance with earlier studies, and we have shown it before, seen it before. However, one important thing is that return to work rates were quite high also for those who were fully unable in the previous anniversary. And this is actually very encouraging knowledge for us, and hopefully also those with longer time disabilities, that they still have opportunity to return to work, even though the disability would have lasted a year, which is the case here. I also have to point out this one question: what's wrong with rehabilitation? Because there are few worrisome stuff. First of all, the number of rehabilities was pretty small. The permanence of rehabilitation was high. And the most important thing is that rehabilitation did not promote return to work as well as expected. So something might be wrong, but we have to remember that there are occupational rehabilitation programs that can last years, so we don't know the full answers with only 5 years observation period. And however, there is still need for a more thorough investigation of this matter. Last but not least, the last discussion point. The promoters of working were pretty much the same as previous studies have already shown us, and now we were able to show that also the working on the previous anniversary of the injury is a major predictor of working on later stages in life. Few strengths and limitations. As we all know by now, several studies already have examined the predictors and patterns of return to work, but the results are a bit inconsistent, and the inconsistencies result from differences in target population, selection criteria, study design, data analysis, and observation period. Our data was quite reliable and versatile. We determined return to work by employment contracts, and we also had relatively long follow-up periods. So these are the pros of our study. There are also a few limitations. And the first one is that we concentrated purely on the anniversaries of the accident. So the life situation between the anniversaries remained unknown. And therefore, the overall picture of transition between working, inability to work, rehabilitation, and other life situation was simplified. We also didn't have any information regarding stakeholders' activities and interactions, which have been proved to affect the return to work outcomes. In addition, we didn't have any information about social, clinical, and psychological factors, and they have also been proved to be important factors for return to work. And my last slide, the conclusions, something to take with you maybe, are here. So firstly, remember that the current life situation of the injured is a strong predictor of later working, and it should hence be taken into account. The second one, rehabilitation and return to work programs should start in time because there is clear declining return to work rates when the disability continues. And the third one, the probability of recovery is still relatively high even for those who have longer term disabilities. So promotion of return to work is highly recommended also for this target group. So I thank you all for your interest and can now answer the questions if there were any and if we have any time. Sorry, I guess I just went a bit over time here.
Don't worry about it, Jarna. Thank you so much for sharing your impressive work and taking the time to present today. Our Q&A session will start immediately. So if you have any questions, please insert them in the question box. And we'll start with the first question. So you've mentioned that some of the compensations are either daily allowance, disability pension, rehab allowance, and other compensations. Can you give an example of those other compensations?
Yes, I can. Yes, thank you. The other compensations are, for example, some sort of equipment. So if for example, you become blind and you need some sort of equipment, or maybe dog for yourself. And then there are also stuff like travel expenses that they are paying. What else? I think they are the most important ones, but they are not for compensating the lost income. They are these sort of other compensations.
Okay, thank you so much for your explanation. Next one was, so I'm not sure if you if your research included that, but do you have any idea what improvements can be made to increase the probability of return to work?
Unfortunately, this research did not include that. It's an excellent question and should, of course, be researched. And I think that there are already many best best practices, these sort of lists that you should check out. But unfortunately, in the light of this research, I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, thank you so much. And I believe we'll just go with our last question. So, in your opinion, what areas were neglected or need further work looking at this field of return to work and rehabilitation?
An excellent question again. So, what areas were neglected? Well, first of all, these best practices that were just asked. Well, this, of course, didn't answer any of them. Also, this research didn't, well, it showed that there might be something interesting to research about the unemployment stuff. So is there some sort of relation between work-related injuries and unemployment? Why did it seem to be a bit higher? And then maybe the most important question is the one with the rehabilitation. So how effective is actually occupational rehabilitation after work-related injury? Because at least I've read a lot research made about occupational rehabilitation, but not in the field of work-related injuries. And the results of our study were pretty worrisome, as I've already mentioned.
Thank you so much, Erna. Before the end of the webinar, would you like to add anything?
No, I think this was it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your compelling presentation. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us.